Good morning, everyone, and good evening to our participants from around the world, or good afternoon. Our webinar today is going to focus on three interrelated issues. First, supply chains. Second, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And third, the critical sector of critical minerals. Now, each topic is sufficiently rich for its own webinar, but we're going to discuss all of these issues in tandem over the next hour during this webinar. And we're doing this in conjunction with the launch of a new Asia Society Policy Institute paper entitled Strengthening the Resiliency of Regional Supply Chains. The paper is less focused on describing the challenges and more focused on providing suggested solutions to the challenges that we face. And to do this, we have an incredible international audience with three premier international trade, international economic security speakers. During my career, I've worked closely with all three, and I can't think of a better group to have this discussion with. First, my colleague from Korea, Han-koo is now a non-resident distinguished fellow at the Asia Society Policy Institute, but we all remember him as a recent trade minister of Korea. And this followed about a 30-year career working for the Korean government on trade issues. Andrew Jory is joining us from the Australian Embassy here in Washington, where he serves as a Minister-Counsellor for Trade. He's been part of the Australian trade negotiating team for many years, working on almost any negotiation you can think of, including CPTPP and the EU-Australia FTA, which I understand now may be in the final stages. And last but not least, we have a longtime colleague of mine from Indonesia, Iman Pambagyo, who is a former trade negotiator for Indonesia. I think he's best well known as the chairman of the RCEP Trade Negotiating Committee, where he played an instrumental role in bringing that 15-party Asian agreement into force. So we will be proceeding with the program, but before I do so, we will be taking questions from the audience during the later portion of the webinar. So feel free to put your questions either in the chat box or the Q&A box. So let's start now. And Han-koo, can I turn it over to you as a co-author of the report? Can you share with us some of the major takeaways from this paper? And particularly, I'd be interested in kind of your motivation for drafting this paper, because I know when you were Korean Trade Minister, you were instrumental in the shaping and working with the United States on IPEF in its early stages. Over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. First of all, thank you to Wendy and Asia Society for organizing this very important webinar, and also all the support provided to develop this paper. First, let me start off by providing sort of a big picture overview of what we try to achieve through this paper. I have about 10 minutes or so. So I think during this pandemic and afterwards, we really learned that no country is immune to this kind of supply chain disruption, nor manage them on their own. So we believe that IPEF is actually one of the most advanced international discussion and negotiation to develop this new framework, a new generation framework of a supply chain agreement. Among all the other international fora, such as G20, APEC, or you name it, and stands the best chance of really taking a meaningful step forward to forge some, this kind of new supply chain agreement. And if you look at this IPEF member country, it's an incredibly, diverse pool of countries, from developed to developing countries, but also resource rich to resource poor countries, energy exporting to importing countries. So this is really a microcosm of the broader world. So whatever IPEF develop in this among this group of countries, I think it could serve as a sort of the new template or prototype for supply chain agreement. So let me just take the summon actual the case of supply chain crisis at this point, because I think it's a meaningful exercise to think through hypothetically in that kind of crisis. If IPEF were in place, what could have been done differently? In other words, what kind of element or feature needs to be included in IPEF? So let me take an example from Korea, which is a urea crisis in November 2021. Probably you may never heard of this urea, but it's a very low end. In Korea, it's a requirement to put into its diesel vehicle, basically to reduce its carbon emission. But at that time, China, all of a sudden, they imposed the export restriction. And the ripple effect hit Korea the hardest and the most directly. So in market, the supplies really dried up and the market panicked. And, the millions of truck fleet and also this emergency vehicle could face a kind of a crisis of, stopping any day if they don't find these alternative sources. But clearly there was a market failure. I mean, our private sector wasn't ready to prepare for this kind of contingency, and the government had to come in to intervene. And actually, one of the interesting and the extreme case. I mean, the government even flew this military aircraft to bring in this 27,000 liters of urea solution from Australia. So you can see the urgency and this desperateness of the situation at that time. So with this case in mind, if the IPEF were in place at that time, how things could have been different in Korea. So, now we go to the policy recommendation. First, the supply chain mapping and the early warning system. Obviously, at that time, we didn't have this supply chain mapping, we didn't really have this system of gathering information and sharing information. But if IPEF countries do this, supply chain mapping in, some of this critical or sensitive raw material, then they have a better understanding of where their weaknesses are, where their choke points are, and from each country in IPEF members, they could turn to help, for this in time of this crisis, right? And also, so this kind of mapping exercise would be critical, and also this information gathering and the sharing scheme would be critical, because in the end, this critical information needs to come from private sector in the real time. So, but also it's important to strike a right balance between, this securing this, pertinent real-time market information from the private sector, and also making sure that their confidential or proprietary business information is not compromised. So I think this is a lot of work, and the IPEF needs to develop some sort of the sustained structure to dedicate this kind of work. Second is crisis response mechanism. I mean, going back to this urea crisis, I mean, the government at that time, as well as the private sector, we didn't really, have a clue of where, in the swift manner, where we could find these alternative sources for urea. So at that time, the government mobilized actually, diplomatic, worldwide diplomatic network to find this alternative source. So if IPEF countries had, all these, better understanding of this, the IPEF-wide, this supply chain network, if at that time, let's say Indonesia or the Philippines had, kind of a plenty of this urea sources, then I think it could have been much easier. And if the IPEF had developed some sort of the cooperation framework to, exchange these scarce resources in a time of this crisis, I think that could have been helpful. So I think it might be a bold and creative idea, but exploring the replicating the concept in the financial world of this currency swap system into the supply chain world. I think that could also, worth exploring. And especially also this kind of this crisis response mechanism would be really effective when any one or two, or countries face economic coercion by a country outside this IPEF network, to collectively, to respond to this kind of crisis. And thirdly, establishing this new guidelines and standard to really restrain this the discretionary use of this export restriction among these member countries with this WTO plus elements. I don't have to really, explain, but this, for example, enhancing the transparency and also streamlining this fast track, this customs procedure, and also kind of encouraging, maintaining, and not encouraging, but maintaining this the cross-border, the movement of essential people to keep the supply chain work forward. The lastly but not least, I think co-investment and also this connectivity issue would be really critical, especially in the absence of a market access element. In here, I think the most important is that this IRA. I mean, in many of these rich countries in the IPEF network is not eligible for this IRA, the EV tax credit and so on. So we really kind of propose that the U.S. negotiate with these IPEF countries for this similar the critical raw materials agreement as they did with Japan and European Union. And also, we think that this IPEF country could play a more active role to really encourage this co-investment and also diversification of this the supply chain in the region by, for example, establishing this private-public sector investment cooperation forum, for example, and they could sort of bridge the whatever information gap and where this market failure happens. And also, one of the biggest bottleneck is really the different regulatory regime and also the red tapes, etc., and investment grievances. So I think the IPEF countries could also think about introducing this investment ombudsman system, sort of a one-stop service to really address these investment grievances. And so far, I've talked about, we talk about this more sector-wide work, but also we believe that a sector-specific work, especially in this critical raw material, would be really helpful. I think we can come back to this issue later. So in conclusion, I think this is really immense work. I mean, it doesn't happen overnight. So I think realistically, I think it's prudent to kind of take more phased approach. Obviously, 2023 is a great year for political momentum because U.S. is a chair of APEC 2023. So I think IPEF countries could aim to kind of conclude at least this rulemaking part of the negotiation by the end of this year. But we also like to emphasize that it has to really go beyond just rulemaking. Going back to this kind of crisis actual case, getting actually this help in that time of contingency, the need more concrete, more tangible this cooperation mechanism work. So from next year, I think the IPEF countries can continue to work on the sector-specific work and then actually doing all this nitty-gritty, this groundwork to make this kind of cooperation mechanism actually work. And in the more medium term, when this political environment online, I think adding the market access element would be also critical for the long-term success of IPEF. So in conclusion, we welcome this opportunity of IPEF as a way to reshape and bolster this regional supply chain through this new generation economic arrangement. And it could serve as a really new model for future collective these actions in this supply chain. So thank you. Wendy, if I may missed anything, and if you want to add, please,
Well, I think you did a great job summarizing our report. which I will just say is on our website and available to everyone. Andrew, maybe I can turn to you now. How would you assess IPEF progress so far, particularly in the supply chain sector, where there has been discussion about perhaps even early harvest agreements around the trade ministers meeting in May in Detroit on supply chains? So welcome your views here. And also, do you think, or do you agree with something Han-koo said, that if IPEF is successful in the supply chain world and setting up rules and cooperation mechanisms, that IPEF could serve as a template for other agreements in these areas internationally? Over to you.
Thanks very much, Wendy, and thanks to the Asia Society for having me. Pleasure to be here and pleasure to be with these panelists. I think that IPEF is actually tracking very well, and particularly on the supply chain pillar, Gina Raimondo is exercising a lot of leadership, so it's possible that we will see some early outcomes. I think in terms of supply chains, there are two sort of elements that we can look at. So one is a crisis response element, and the other is how do we facilitate and build new supply chains. In terms of that crisis management, I mean, one of my teams, or one of my favourite stories of my team from the pandemic was, not only did we have to navigate export restrictions in the form of the US Defence Production Act, but we also often had to go out and source things directly. As Han-koo was saying about the urea shortage, governments did intervene in markets or even source things commercially for particular suppliers during that crisis mode. So I think IPEF offers a real opportunity to harmonise and bring together a group of countries and really make that an efficient and streamlined process, but not only make it a sort of much more streamlined process, but also make it more efficient and potentially proactive. In terms of the second element and building new supply chains, IPEF has a real opportunity here. And there are some great recommendations in the paper in terms of harmonising standards. Really like the idea of swaps. There are innovative things that countries can do, but if we're looking at new sectors where we're trying to diversify supply chains, there's an opportunity for IPEF to really look at the barriers that stand in the way to creating some of those new supply chains. Happy to talk about those a little bit later, particularly in terms of critical minerals. But I think that there is been a lot of political will for IPEF, and there is an opportunity to do something different in this space that's quite useful for participants.
Well, thank you. And now, Iman, over to you. From Indonesia's perspective, how important is the supply chain pillar as one of the four pillars of IPEF? And I know initially Indonesia did have some reservations about joining IPEF. Is your sense that Indonesia feels like it's getting enough from IPEF to participate fully in all four pillars?
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you, Asia Society, for inviting me to this webinar. I think talking about Indonesian perspective, I have to say that from our point of view, many countries have devised Indo-Pacific strategies from the standpoint of countering the rise of China in one. So I think you have to understand where we're coming from in this point. And in fact, it has been reinforced by some statement. For example, during the visit of President Biden to Tokyo in May 2022, Nikkei Asia reported that the president will discuss with his Japan's counterpart, the IPEF, which is tailored PAC seeks to counter China's clout while protecting U.S. workers. So in our part of the world, Indonesia and I believe some colleagues from ASEAN countries sees the IPEF as a U.S.-centric initiative. I'm not denying the fact that some ideas being offered in the IPEF is something that ASEAN countries, including Indonesia, would be interested in looking into more detail. But I think if we can somehow distance ourselves from the notion of the IPEF is U.S.-led initiative and make it more, like a bilateral initiative, it will be easier for countries like Indonesia or ASEAN countries to accept and work on the ideas. Now, talking about the supply chains pillar of the IPEF, I think, again, the colleagues need to understand that if we talk about critical minerals or materials, I think we are more from the producing countries of those critical minerals and materials. Most of us in Indonesia, in ASEAN, don't process those materials and minerals, the critical minerals and materials. I think it would be more encouraging for Indonesia and ASEAN to see this idea in a broader perspective, rather than looking at the list of critical minerals or materials or products. Of course, countries who need these critical minerals, materials for their processing of semiconductor, for example, and other products, will need these resilient supply chains proposed under the IPEF. But countries like Indonesia and some other ASEAN countries who don't process those materials would see this thing from a different perspective. But having said that, I think one of the suggestions that the supply chains resilience under the IPEF should promote supply chain connectivity and co-investment opportunities. It is something that would really attract countries like Indonesia and other in ASEAN or critical mineral materials producing countries, because I think it can be understood that we would like to climb the ladder of regional supply chains to be able to process those materials. And I stop there with it.
Great. Well, thank you. In our paper, we underscore the importance of public-private partnerships. And I think we say something along the lines that in, traditional trade agreements, the private sector plays a role, but that's largely to kind of input into proposals. And obviously, after a trade agreement goes into effect, it's the private sector that, is looked to take advantage of the rules and the market access provided in those agreements. But when it comes to supply chains, we argue that the private sector plays a critical role and really in some ways needs a seat at the table, or we need to figure out a way to work closely with the private sector as governments, because the private sector, at the end of the day, they make a lot of these supply chain decisions. Han-koo alluded to one of the important recommendations in our paper, and that is setting up a system to allow private companies feel comfortable providing important information about their supply chains, including choke points and vulnerabilities, to the governments. So I'd be interested in your views on what is the appropriate role of the private sector in the supply chain discussions. Is IPath looking to set up some type of fora or venue to include the private sector? And what do you think about what are the prospects for private companies really supplying the type of supply chain information that would be useful to all IPEF members as they try and map out choke points, vulnerabilities, as well as opportunities? Mm-hmm. Han-koo, I'll start with you.
Yes, thanks for a great question. Yes, as Wendy explained, we think that this private sector in this supply chain agreement is actually major player not just one of many stakeholders, but actually the major player to make things happen. Yes, you mentioned what kind of incentive for private sector to cooperate. I mean, if you look at this Korea's case in the urea case, for example, each company in this urea industry, they just the working silo, pursuing their own profit maximization and cost efficiency, and then as a result, when this kind of unprecedented the shortage, the crunch hit, I think they were really at a loss. So I think also this is to the benefit of the private sector to work with the government and sharing this information, etc. And also, as Iman mentioned, I think and also the Andrew mentioned, the another important element is building new supply chain. I mean, we were talking about this crisis response management, but more fundamental change needs to happen by diversifying this co-investment in the region. And the private sector makes it happen. So how can we, in the framework of IPEF, to develop this systematic, the framework in which the private sector and government come together and then explore this kind of win-win, solutions and the mechanism. I think that will be critical.
Andrew, maybe you can follow up on this. I mean, do you agree with this? And what do you think the prospects are for finding a meaningful role for the private sector in these discussions and in these mechanisms?
I think the key here is about finding a balance. So when you talk to the private sector writ large, they talk about some of their supply chain information as being their comparative advantage, and they're reluctant to pass it over. In saying that, there almost wouldn't be one day of the week where we're not working with a company on a supply chain issue as a government, and that's just at the embassy. So, I think it's about finding a balance, and clearly some products governments have more have identified, particularly post the pandemic, as being more important for their societies. So it's often, a lot of governments now have lists of critical commodities or critical technologies or critical products. And so there's already a lot of interaction there between the private sector and governments in terms of monitoring what's happening with those supply chains. The reality is that governments do have a role to play in helping the private sector, particularly where there are export restrictions or where there are difficult regulatory environments, which is the reality for many of these critical goods. So I think, it would actually be quite efficient to bring this together under one committee in IPEF, where you could have both private sector representatives that were impacted and also have governments. And I think, we saw this during the pandemic where we were lobbying the White House or the US government for access to particular products. And we would often be in meetings where it would be an American company, an Australian company, US government, and the Australian government. And often there were other governments, around the world that couldn't be on those calls, but we were waiting on information from them before the US government would decide to release the product or whatever. So I think it actually is an economy of scale here and can create some efficiencies, provided it's done in an even-handed way and doesn't create a burden for the private sector. But I mean, our sense is that there are commodities and there are products where the private sector is already coming to governments asking for help in terms of managing their supply chains. How we turn that into something that can look forward and not just look backwards, I think is a really interesting challenge for IPEF in terms of trying to, manage what is the next supply chain problem as opposed to reacting to problems that exist at the moment.
Iman, you have a lot of experience in the trade world, and I'd just be interested in your views of how do you integrate the private sector into these discussions? And are there any models from anything you've worked on previously that should be looked at?
Yes, Wendy, I think trade wars both by COVID-19 and war in Ukraine has created a situation where business depended on the government to take action, and perhaps not really appropriate word, perhaps salvage business. So government take action in the forefront, and what we have been seeing is the rise of mercantilism. Government knows everything, right? But I think looking into the new future, the new order, the new post supply chain disruption, I think we have to bring in back business into the conversation. Of course, the issue of property information and so on and so forth can be discussed a little bit further, but there should be a will from the government to engage business in a balanced way. And I think the IPEF could provide this avenue, the need for us to develop resilient supply chains to minimize possible greater disruption in the future and so on and so forth. So business should be heard, business should be invited to talk about their needs, because at least what I saw in Jakarta, the government feel that they know everything and business should follow the government. Even one of the cabinet member of in Indonesia said that, guys, if you haven't been in the government, just shut up. I think that's a wrong attitude from the government, but it has been created by the situation, by trade war, COVID, and then war in Ukraine. So I think IPEF, in particular the supply chains initiative, could provide the venue for government to invite business to tackle that. But again, I think somehow we need to widen the scope of the discussion when we talk about supply chain. So from Indonesian perspective, for example, when we talk about critical minerals, materials, and so on, very little business in Indonesia engage in that particular sector. So perhaps it is time for us to bring back the business into the conversation.
We can just briefly touch upon the relationship between trade agreements and initiatives like IPEF dealing with supply chains. You've all been in the trade world, and I think you'd agree with me that trade agreements in some respects are supply chain agreements, in that there's a group of like-minded countries, you get rid of barriers, you're encouraging trade and investment among those countries. So I'd be interested if you share that view, or do you think that supply chain, like a supply chain chapter, could be included in trade agreements? Is that one way to look at it? Or are the problems associated and challenges associated with supply chains so different than what's in trade agreements that it makes sense to have kind of these parallel economic agreements? Andrew, maybe I'll start with you here.
Sure. I mean, I think it depends what problem you're trying to fix. If you're looking at a crisis management situation like we were in the pandemic, then I think IPEF genuinely offers something new and a sort of new approach. If we're trying to create new and diversified and strong supply chains, we need to be clear about the economic reality of the world out there, which is that trade agreements are efficient ways of allocating resources. So you look at big agreements like the CPTPP or RCEP, the reality is that the regional rules of origin and the collective lowering of tariffs are obviously going to facilitate supply chain activity and global supply chains amongst those participants. And I think if we want IPEF to build new supply chains and create diversified supply chains, we need to be clear that it doesn't have the capacity to compete in one sense with those regional trade agreements that do lower tariffs and that do have regional rules of origin. So IPEF is going to have to be creative, and negotiators are going to have to work extra hard to create incentives for businesses to either, move a supply chain in a particular way. Now, that's not impossible. I think there are a range of things that negotiators can look at, and some of them are in your paper. Harmonising standards, I think, is an excellent idea that can, is often one that is overlooked and can be as important and as problematic as a tariff or a rule of origin in sort of preventing access. Co-investment is another very good idea from your paper in terms of trying to, bring together different forms of capital, particularly for some of the critical supply chains where governments are increasingly becoming involved, whether that's in Indo-Pacific or elsewhere. And then, there are advantages, I think, in terms of some of the efficiencies that you can bring if you can have a committee structure that is able to solve real-world supply chain problems like the urea problem, which might not be a trade problem or, might not be able to be fixed through tariffs alone. But, we do have to be clear, and we can't pretend that there aren't strong regional economic trade architecture which shifts supply chains in particular ways.
Han-koo, how do you think about the relationship between trade agreements and economic initiatives like IPEF, particularly when dealing with supply chain challenges?
Basically, in our paper, I think you took the position that, this traditional trade agreements such as CPTPP and RCEP are complementary with this IPEF. It's not really mutually exclusive. In a way, this traditional trade agreement really, help accelerating this supply chain development and, increasing this interdependence and efficiency among these, major players. But also, it didn't really help kind of alleviating this potential, the risk or this kind of a disruption, resilience issues. So in that sense, I think, we need both. We still need to, continue to market opening and it is kind of a trade agreement, but also we need to have added features of, strengthening this resilience in the supply chain. So in that sense, I think there is no one-size-fits-all approach. This IPEF is a really kind of all-out supply chain focused new generation type of arrangement. But also, I think we could add, supply chain chapters into bilateral FTA or the CPTPP or RCEP going forward. For example, in Korea, when we sort of explore this upgrade of Korea-UK free trade agreement, we agreed to include the supply chain chapter to kind of try and experiment with this sort of new approach. So, that's my,
And how about Iman? Maybe I can turn to you. Do you see trade agreements and these economic initiatives complementary? And then maybe I can ask you, as the chairman, former chairman of the RCEP negotiations, has RCEP actually impacted the development and strengthening of supply chains with other RCEP countries? A year into effect, have you seen anything to suggest that RCEP has influenced supply chains in the region?
Yes, when I read this the paper, my first thinking is that it would be good if we can bring this to enrich the trade facilitation agreement under WTO, because the supply chains not really expressed in that particular agreement. But going into this process will take some years to go. Now, I concur with the previous speaker saying that the existing agreement and the IPEF, in particular, supply chains part of it, is quite complementary. I'm hoping that somehow in the near future, the countries of RCEP parties will be agreeable to negotiate and to add a chapter, for example, on supply chain resilience under the RCEP. So I see the merits of countries under different trade agreements to see these ideas. But again, it is necessary to broaden the scope of this concept rather than looking at the specific critical minerals and materials, because when we talk about supply chains, it covers everything, where we need almost everything from other countries as well. Now, I see that, in a sense, the RCEP that has been enforced for 1.5 years somehow help member countries to continue their supply chains activities. I understand that Japan, for example, has managed to maximize their supply chains activities in the automotive sectors, for example. And I believe China also has managed to benefit from the agreement under the RCEP in a sense that they continue to deepen and expand the supply chains connectivity among the RCEP member states. But since it has been 1.5 years in the force, and Indonesia just last January entered into this agreement, I think it remains to be seen how far, how deep the RCEP could contribute to the deepening and expanding of the supply chains in this region. But again, if we could add the element from IPEF, in particular the resilient supply chain sub-pillar, it would enrich further the RCEP, and I think for that matter, the CPTPP and other agreements as well.
Andrew, how about your view on this? Have you seen any evidence that RCEP has resulted in strengthened supply chain connectivity in the region, or, as Iman said, maybe it's just too early to tell?
I think we do track trade under all of our free trade agreements, so the bilateral trade agreements, and also our regional trade agreements, in terms of we look at where our exports are going. I think it's extremely clear to us that traders in Australia utilise the free trade agreements that we have, and are trading under those. I think that, clearly some of those arrangements help strengthen supply chains. And, that's very clear from, the flow of products that we see, and in terms of, how products are made using inputs from Australia across the region, be it CPTPP or RCEP. So there's clearly a role for those types of trade agreements in, helping create an environment for supply chains, and strengthening supply chains. They don't have to be the only measures that can strengthen supply chains, So I think some of the ideas that you have in terms of, just removing regulatory barriers across jurisdictions, and harmonising standards or having equivalency of standards where possible, can be a huge pull factor for particular products. That's something that traders can spend a lot of time on, and small businesses can spend a lot of time on. Similar with some of the ideas that you had in terms of the swap, financial swaps, in terms of where one product could be supplied by a participating country to another and then paid back at another time. I think that's an ingenious way of looking at supply chain problems, and we've seen that, in relation to the war in Ukraine, with Japan and Korea, forwarding LNG that they had, making it available for Europe in response for swaps later on. So, there are very clever things that can be done. So, yes, clearly for Australia, trade agreements make a difference in terms of strengthening supply chains. But that doesn't mean that there aren't other policy options that we shouldn't look at and that we are looking at in terms of IPEF.
Han-koo, maybe I could just ask you just to delve into a little more detail on this currency swap type of how this kind of system could be used with respect to supply chain or stockpiles in individual governments. I think the idea is in times of crisis, you could help other countries out by drawing down your stockpile, and then over time, the other country then would kind of pay you back. Mm-hmm. But it's one way to get through a crisis. And I've already heard that this idea is very innovative. So you're the author of it. Anything you want to share with us on it?
Yes. Thank you for that brilliant question. I think this is, considered like radical or, very creative idea. But I mean, if we look at how normally, this crisis evolve, it's just like the fire in the wood. It just start from somewhere in an unexpected way, and then spread like in a matter of days. So I think in financial the crisis as well, but in this supply chain crisis, really just stabilizing the market in a matter of days, that is a critical step. And if that's the case, you are not talking about 1 month or 2 months, but just we talk about this matter of days. Why can't we just borrow the concept from this the currency swap to be applied to this physical world? As Wendy mentioned, I think many countries to maintain and manage this strategic stockpile. For example, the U.S. has about 50 list of critical minerals. Japan, I think 34. Korea 33. So. And many of these, the lists kind of overlap. But I mean, hypothetically, all countries, 14 countries, face the same crisis of the same product. Then I think this concept wouldn't work, right? But like the Korea's case, the urea, if the problem is a country specific, and among this IPEF, the network, country A has a serious shortage of, material A, but country B, C has some, the surplus or spare, this in their stockpile or in the private sector. And I think we could, find a way to use this concept. For example, during this, the time of this urea crisis in Korea, of course, our private sector tried to, secure these alternative sources from private sector in other countries, but obviously they weren't prepared. They didn't know where to go find these alternative sources. But also at that time, the situation was so, the urgent that the government also considered putting this, government money, the budget, to actually purchase by the government. I think the U.S. has also this Defense Production Act to mobilize this private sector resources in a time of, the war or crisis moment. So I think this could be, controversial in many countries because, by nature, the strategic stockpile is a very precious material. And the idea is just borrowing or, letting other countries to draw down by purchase or borrow. I think that could be controversial. But I think if we, understand the nature of this problem and how could we, formulate this collective response by kind of, this kind of external shock, but also in times of economic coercion, and I think we could carve out some kind of comfortable space where this public sector intervene with this kind of swap idea. Yeah.
And to the extent that IPEF is working on a crisis review mechanism, maybe this is something that they should explore. And as you say, there are a lot of complications because by definition, stockpiles are for, national needs during an emergency. But as you mentioned, this is a different world today. And, everyone's experienced these kind of supply chain shortages. And our paper does detail this urea crisis in Korea and then the steps Korea took, and kind of contrasting it with the way if IPEF had been in place with some of these mechanisms, maybe that crisis wouldn't have been as acute as it was. Iman, I wanted to just turn to you on the issue of export restrictions, because one of the recommendations in our paper is that we build on the WTO rules on export restrictions, which I'll paraphrase to mean like there's a prohibition, but then it's basically, but you can go ahead with them as long as they're temporary and transparent, et cetera. Now, Indonesia has imposed some export restrictions on nickel in 2020. And my understanding is that you may be imposing export restrictions on bauxite, maybe even as early as next month. What our paper, it doesn't say export restrictions should be banned, but it says we should kind of build out those concepts of temporary and transparent, and kind of make it more difficult for countries to put export restrictions in force. And if they do, then maybe they should be time limited. Maybe they should be, sunsetted. And, new ways to make them transparent from day one. So how do you respond to that? You're a trade person, you know the WTO. Actually, my understanding also, if I'm correct, is the Indonesia nickel ban has been viewed as WTO inconsistent in a recent dispute settlement finding. So over to you. You're kind of smiling. I know it's a difficult issue, but I'm sure you can massage it.
Thank you, Andy, for this quite interesting question. Where should I start from? I think the IPEF would provide the avenue for Indonesia to rethink its policies of banning export of critical minerals, in particular, in this case, the one that has been brought into the WTO. I'm not necessarily supportive of the government's policies in banning export. Of course, there are some provision in WTO where you're allowed to restrict export, right? But with some justification, and it should be temporary in nature. But I think where this policy comes from in Indonesia, I think it comes from the vision of Indonesia becoming an industrial countries. And for that reason, Indonesia would like to climb the ladder of the supply chains by way of processing some of the minerals in Indonesia. But if you ask whether it has met its objective, frankly speaking, I don't think so. And I have to be frank with you, not all Indonesian, in particular business sector, agree with these policies. There are some discussion behind the door talking about the ramification of Indonesia taking this action, because partner countries would respond in a way that we might find difficult to enter their markets with other products. But of course, again, this is the more a political discussion in Indonesia about it. You say you're right. Bauxite would be restricted, perhaps later this month or next month. And I heard that there are about 30 something more commodities would be restricted. But I'm hoping that it will be not the case. Of course, the question is whether Indonesia would be interested in entering into negotiation for the sake of example, negotiating a trade deal with the US in order to benefit from IRA tax credits. I think that's not the way it should be, because what has been wrong is wrong. This should be clear. You should not be awarded because you're doing wrong, and then you negotiated something and then you get a tax credit, and those countries could access the mineral from Indonesia. I think we have to be clear. If the policy is wrong, we have to be clear. It is wrong. But again, it's more political discussion in Indonesia about this, and I don't necessarily support people for this policy. But again, we've been waiting for quite some time, so the verdict from the WTO, and we'll see where we go from there.
Okay, we're coming to the witching hour. Andrew, I'd like to ask you a question that was raised in the audience, and that is, what is the role of, how active a role is India playing in the supply chain work? Because India in particular in recent years has undertaken a number of measures to attract more foreign direct investment and to attract investment associated with some of these shifts in supply chains taking place in the region. We all know India is not a player is not a participant in the trade pillar, but are they very active in the supply chain pillar? And is this a pillar where India thinks that it has a lot to gain?
They really are. They hosted the round recently in New Delhi, and
the commerce round, right? But on the commerce pillars, yeah.
Supply chain pillar amongst the other ones.
Yeah,
I think that they see a real opportunity there. I mean, the report that we received in our system of that was just absolutely glowing of the leadership that India had exercised in relation to all of those pillars and that particular one. I think that there's a real opportunity here for IPEF and supply chain pillars, just picking up some of the comments of the last speaker in terms of critical minerals. The United States, to realise the manufacturing boom that it wants for the green transition under the Inflation Reduction Act, is going to need inputs from around the world. It wants to do that in a way that creates new supply chains. The reality is that IPEF partners are rich in those critical minerals. And so I think there's a real opportunity to match up interests here in terms of, whilst we understand the United States wants to do as much of that mining and processing in the United States as possible, you can't subsidise your way out of geology. And so the rocks are where the rocks are. And the rocks happen to be in Australia and in Indonesia and the Philippines. So, there is just a real opportunity here, if the administration and the Congress wants it, to create new supply chains. And the reality is those F-150s are not going to be made in Dearborn unless the US has those materials. And we're dealing with a market failure when it comes to critical minerals, because whilst the price of lithium is quite high, look at the price of graphite or nickel, cobalt, a lot of them are actually below the cost of production because, the world suffers from a monopolistic player who, raises the price and then drops it depending on their own needs. So I think there's a really strong case for government intervention on critical minerals, and there's just interest that can be matched here in terms of the US is going to need more minerals. The world needs 20 times the amount of lithium by 2030 to meet sort of Paris goals if we're going to have electrification. So IPEF countries have many of these minerals. They're looking to move further down the value chain, and the United States is going to need them and has some incentives there. So I think if the US wants to take a brave step with IPEF, there's a real opportunity for critical mineral supply chains and to take IPEF from here to here.
Okay, well, with that, I loved your comment. You can't subsidize yourself out of geology. The minerals are where they are. But clearly, this is in a very important sector, and one where, given the IPEF participants, IPEF can play a very important role. With that, I'd like to conclude this webinar. I think there is an agreement among the panelists that IPEF has an important role to play in the supply chain area. Negotiators are working hard, as I mentioned earlier. Then we may even see some early outcomes as early as later this month on supply chains. But I think as our paper underscores, there's a lot of work to be done here and a lot of good ideas that should be explored. This problem is not going away, and the challenges that we're facing are not, we can't dismiss. And so I would urge our viewers, first, thanks for joining us, but second, please check out our new paper that's available on the Asia Society website. And with that, thanks to our panelists and thanks to our viewers for sharing the past hour with us.